Thanks everyone for joining. Good afternoon. This is a webinar that will be hosted by the CS360 Training and Technical Assistance Project, and we'll be discussing the CS360 model as a mode for practical problem solving. We'll be joined today by subject matter expert Melissa Royland and Lieutenant Matthew Barter of the Manchester, New Hampshire Police Department. I'll take a second to let Melissa and Matt introduce themselves. Melissa?
Hey, Sarah, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Royland. I'm a consultant. I've been working with the National Policing Institute over many years, partly with the CompStat 360 project, as well as with projects that help police departments respond better to people with mental illnesses. And I'm glad to be here today. Matt?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me, and thanks to the Policing Institute for letting me talk a little bit about what we're doing in Manchester. Matt Barter, I'm a lieutenant here at Manchester Police Department. I serve as chief of staff for the department, which essentially involves a lot of strategic alignment among our different areas of the police department, make sure we're all moving in the right direction, as well as a lot of different project management, with CompStat 360 being one of those projects. So look forward to talking a little bit about Manchester.
Great, thank you guys. And my name is Sarah Vanslow. I'm a project associate with the National Policing Institute, and I'm the point of contact for the CS360 project. And so again, we're very excited to have you all with us here today. And just a couple of housekeeping items before we go ahead and jump into everything. Everybody should have been put on mute when you entered, and we just ask that you try to stay on mute throughout the webinar. That way we can get through the presentation and then hopefully have some time at the end for questions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the chat and we'll get to them at the end. And if we don't have time to get to the questions for any reason, feel free to send them to us in an email, and I'll put my email address in the chat. And it's at the end of the presentation as well for you to send that along to. This webinar is also being recorded, and we'll post that to the CS360 website shortly after this presentation. And I can post the link to the website as well. And also, we would just like to ask at the end of this, we'll send out a post-webinar survey evaluation. If you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to fill that out once we get a chance to send it over to you all. And with that, I'll jump in. And before we get started with Matt and Melissa, I just wanted to take a minute to provide a brief background on what the CS360 project is. CS360 is rooted in the best practices and lessons learned from the traditional CompStat approach, which I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with. So as you know, CompStat focuses primarily on the Part 1 crime measurement. CS360 takes this further to build on that foundation by taking more of a proactive and problem-solving approach. And it also emphasizes community collaboration, responsiveness, strategic problem-solving, and community satisfaction. The model accomplishes this by employing a 360-degree approach to data collection and analysis and decision-making to ensure that law enforcement agencies are able to approach public safety comprehensively. And so these are the dimensions of the CS360 model. The first being to prevent, interrupt, and solve crime, integrate and elevate community and governmental partners, and maximize organizational effectiveness. And within each of these dimensions are goals that are related. And so I'm going to pop those up on the screen now for you all to review. I know there's kind of a lot of information on this slide now, so I won't go too much in depth into it. But I just wanted you to be able to see these 4 goals that make up each of the dimensions. As the department begins to apply the CS360 approach, we would like them to, or we encourage them to work to address at least one of the goals from each of the dimensions in order to have a full holistic approach to the model. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Melissa to talk about problem solving.
Thanks, Sarah. Next slide. We were just joking about how nobody really likes to say that. So the heart of the CS360 is this problem solving process. And again, many of you may be familiar with problem solving either in a different realm of your life or in the context of policing and community policing. So I'll just give you a little bit of a kind of the tips, the highlights in terms of how we like to run the problem solving process in the CS360. And the first point on the slide is using data to come to consensus on problems and causes. Now, this can be a very long process. It's only one bullet, right? But it's a lot more complicated than that. And I just want to say that really what we're talking about here is using data. And when we say data, we mean information about the problem in your community. We mean, sure, it could be surveys, but it can also just be communicating and talking with your community members about what's bothering them, sort of what their issues are, and what they've observed, right, in their communities that concerns them. And certainly more traditional police data is used, calls for service data, arrests and that sort of thing. But the idea is to use this data to identify problems and then work together to come to consensus on what the problem is that you want to focus on. Second bullet, collaborative responses, critical to all community policing efforts and certainly very critical to CS360. And one of the things that distinguishes it from other CompStat models. We're going to talk a little bit more about collaboration in a minute. But I want to emphasize here that this process is not unidirectional, right? This is not about police telling the community what the problems are and the police deciding what to do. It has to do with coming together with the community to identify what that response should be and engage them in aspects of that response. Next, you would implement the response. Let's see what's happening. And this is part of the whole problem solving process where you implement the response, you check your data to see if it's being affected by your program or your response, and then you measure, right? How is this working? There are often members of the community in the department who will need to see progress reports and provide input on what's going on or provide authority to use funds or staffing. So there is a step here about reviewing those lessons learned with those senior committees and people, and then work together with them and their communities if things need to be changed or adapted, which is often the case. This is why it's a circular process and involves a sort of a constant loop until you feel that you've met your goals. So next slide. So again, just to touch a little bit on this value of collaboration, we feel that collaborating with the community, and we'll talk a little bit more about what we mean by community, is the key, right, to getting a better understanding about the problems in the community. And using data to do that is critical. And I think we already talked about this, but what happens is communities and police come together and the community has their problems and the police department sees their problems from their side of the aisle, as it were. And sometimes they agree on what those problems are, but oftentimes they don't. And I think for many of the folks on this call, you're probably aware that some of the communities are really concerned about one thing and the police are concerned about another. And in many cases, that's really quite okay. But it's also important to be recognizing what sorts of issues are important to community members and their quality of life. And again, communities members need to provide data. They might have surveys or they might participate in focus groups. This augments and enhances the police understanding of the problem. It doesn't replace the police understanding of the problem. It adds to it. And collaboration is designed also to generate a wider range of responses and responders. So community partners can offer solutions and ways to achieve them. And this is what really makes this model so important, is that it doesn't leave the police alone in addressing these issues. It engages the community to put them not just in the complaining seat, right? Not just in the pointing fingers chair, but to say, all right, we're going to work with you on figuring out what we need to do. And we're going to lend you our understanding of the problem so that it can inform what we do together. And then the partners can participate in measuring inputs and outputs. These are the folks that can be sitting down, administering surveys, handing out flyers, putting up leaflets, this sort of thing. So again, it's not just up to the police. If the police were able to do it on their own, they would have already been able to do it. So it's incredibly important for police agencies to engage the community, and Lieutenant Barter's going to talk a lot more about how he's done that in his community, because we can say all these words and they sort of float around and people are like, well, how does this actually work in practice? So I'm really glad that he's here. And there's sort of this side benefit to collaboration, and that is that it builds support, right, and understanding between the police agency and their communities. So and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that also, but you might not necessarily be able to achieve all of your goals, but you've certainly been able to develop better understanding about your community, and your community has developed better understanding about the police department. Next slide. So how do we define community? And we define it broadly. So we're talking about any member of the community, either public and private entities. This can include other government agencies like the courts. We were just having a conversation right before we started about some work that the lieutenant is doing with the court system in the state. And, you know, these other city agencies are very, very important in solving problems. And oftentimes what we find out is that communication has really kind of broken apart. And so this can be a way to identify where that's happened. We also were talking about not-for-profit organizations, advocacy groups, and service providers. So it includes residents, people who live in the community. And what's key here with the yellow light bulb, and if I could put it in yellow and highlight it, right, Sarah? It's that these organizations and individuals have to have a vested interest in the problem. And you usually find those people are the ones that are raising their hand and saying, you know, yeah, that's happening on my street too. Because if they don't have a vested interest in the problem, they're not going to stick with you through what can be a complicated process of problem solving. And it's really important to include both your fans and your critics. This is very difficult to do for organizations, for any organization. It's very difficult to do. And it's certainly very difficult for police agencies in an environment where many, many, many people have become critical of law enforcement. But if we don't include them, then we're really missing out on a whole set of their understanding about how to solve problems. And that really does bolster our ability to solve them. Next slide. So CS360 has a resource that we developed when we were under the grant from BJA. It's this little map, and it really what it does is sort of lay out on the left-hand side the type of organization. And along the top, it talks about the topics that you might be focusing on. So let's say, for example, that you have the problem is health. Maybe you have an uptick, you should pardon the expression, in COVID cases. It lists the type of organizations that you might be able to reach out to in each of the squares below. And sometimes you're going to know, for example, your mental health associations or your hospital associations, if that's something that you need to work with. So you might just Google these terms, right? And make sure that this sort of provides sort of a more comprehensive list than you might automatically think about. And that's the idea, right? Is to bring as many voices to the table as you can. So these resources and many others are available on our website. It's CompStat360.org. Just wanted to make sure to mention that. Next slide. So problem solving teams, right? These are the engine of problem solving. These are the people that come together, right, to work with the police department, the people from all of those different organizations we talked about that you've engaged in working with you on the problem. I'm going to sort of walk through this example, through these steps with an example that's true to my heart, which is working on improving the police response to people with mental illness. And we do find when you conduct scanning in many communities, there are issues. Either it's with people who are in the community who are temporarily unhoused, or you have people who are in crisis in their homes, or maybe a location like a group home, where there might be people who repeatedly become in crisis. And let's say that your community has looked at all of your data and said, you know, there's this group home that we really need to focus on because we get a lot of calls to go back there and we just don't have a lot of resources to deal with it. So you bring all your partners together, you identify, once you've got your problem and you're like, you know what, now that we're really talking about that group home, I think we need to get at that landlord. You know, we need to find the landlord to come in and work with us, or we need to find out what other resources might be available for folks who are in crisis in the community. And then this is sort of, again, one of those steps that I would highlight in yellow. I would just say, conduct analysis and choose a response plan. The analysis piece is really critical. It says, why is the problem occurring? Because what people have a tendency to do is jump in, right? Oh, I know what the problem is. And here's an example of people jumping in. There was a police agency that had a lot of calls coming in from the group home, and the calls were being made at the payphone on the corner. So they removed the payphone on the corner. And that really does seem like, both brilliant and not brilliant. Yes, you are going to stop the calls to the police department, but you're also going to stop any calls to the police department that are meaningful and important, and it's just not really a great way. And that's not why they were calling the police, because they had a phone to call. They were calling the police because there were probably issues, or there were types of arrangements in the home where folks weren't getting the help that they needed. And so instead, right, the collaborative, the problem-solving team got together and interviewed people at the group home and really tried to understand what was going on. And maybe they figured out that the calls were really happening during change of shift. And so maybe there was like kind of a gap in supervision, or a gap in activities. Maybe, folks in the group home didn't have anything to do. So they looked at why they were making those calls. They developed a response that included the partners, right? Because the group home staff that work there, and maybe some advocates and others in the community and peers, maybe these individuals would be happy to come together and do some more activities, or fill in the blanks when it's change of shift. And then working with partners to assess the impact of the response on the problem that you identified, right? Like, so if the measure you were using at the beginning, the data really was about number of calls from individuals at the group home that really didn't reflect a safety issue, you can look at those calls again. So this is a very simple example that kind of rolls out. And I think that, next slide, Sarah, that Lieutenant Barter is going to talk a little bit more about a much more complicated set of circumstances. I'll just touch on this issue of facilitating a problem-solving team. I know that you've all been in lots of meetings in your life, certainly a lot more in the last couple of years, where the meeting wasn't very well run. And people really didn't get a chance to express themselves, or they expressed themselves for a lot longer than you were comfortable listening to them. And some of that has to do with not having a really clear goal for the meeting that you're having, and a really clear set of instructions about how to get to that goal. And this is certainly, we have support and information about this on our website, and there are lots of resources out there. And what we want to highlight is it's so important for everyone in the problem-solving team to have a voice. This is not a town hall where the police come and report on crime stats and then meet with people afterward who want to complain about the truck that's parked on their street. That is really what happens in a lot of communities in America. And what we would like to do is bring the other voice in fact, have the police department talk the least of anybody at the table. And people should be encouraged to bring their data. I think I might have said that a few times already. And the police department needs to attend. Everybody needs to attend and actively participate. People don't get to come and fold their arms and lean back in their chair. Like, that's the agreement that people need to make when the meetings begin. And there's going to be a lot of different views expressed, and everybody needs to be on board with respecting those different views, especially those that are different from what the department is seeing in its own data. So that needs to be respected and important. So next slide, Sarah. So I think we're ready for the lieutenant to take over. Take it away, Matt.
All right, thanks, Melissa. Great segue, because it is what you were discussing with the involvement of the community and having a lot of different perspectives come to the table when it comes to public safety issues. That's what's so exciting to me and to our department with the use of the CompStat 360 model. So it's going to be great to talk about it. There are key things about the CompStat 360 model that I think have worked well for us, that I personally like. So I'm a self-proclaimed data nerd. So the ability to use and leverage data to inform what we're doing is something I really truly believe in. I see there's some other, with the NIJ lead scholar program. I see some of the other scholars on this call, and also with the ASCVP ACDC project, and I see some of those folks on the call. So there's like this webinar has a lot of folks on it who are interested in using and leveraging data. And that's what CompStat 360 allows us to do. But the other great component about it is that community engagement piece and bringing in the community to help us solve these problems. And that's where I believe it's been successful for us. And it hasn't been without challenges, and we'll dive into some of those. But we've been very happy with the model and using that model. So why did we choose the CompStat 360 program? Well, back in, I think it was October 2020, Chief Alan Aldenberg became chief of our police department, and he really wanted to get more strategic with our approaches to public safety issues. I think like many police departments, we were very much in a crisis management mode of whatever the biggest incident was or thing that was going on in the community at that time, that's what got all the attention. And then we would jump to the next thing, and never really come up with these kind of long-term strategic objectives to solve public safety issues. The other thing he really wanted to focus on was making sure we had that community component to it, that we were not going this alone. Especially now, we cannot go alone as police agencies to solve problems. No, it's going to take the whole community. And there's also shared responsibility in a lot of these issues as well. It's not just the police department's issue, it's everybody's issues, to include folks living in the community, to include our partners in public safety and our partners in the nonprofit world and social services and city government. And so it's about bringing everyone together. And so we were looking for a good model. We wanted to make sure we had something that had been reviewed, had some evidence base to it. And so we came across the CompStat 360 model and started to engage and realized that it was something that was going to work really well for us. So we began going into the implementation phase of this project. From the start, I'll say it was really important that we follow the framework of the model. So there's a toolkit available that has been developed by Policing Institute on the CompStat 360 and how to implement. So we tried to really use and leverage that toolkit. Part of that was the use of the community map. We found that very helpful in taking the community map and matching it to folks in the city of Manchester that we could rely on, that we've partnered with before, or we had some type of connection with, and able to put names to positions to get them on board with what we were looking to do in addressing public safety issues. We also used NPI to help with really an independent assessment of what the community concerns were. That's something I think we've struggled with. I think a lot of agencies also struggle with, is what really is, we know what our issues are, right, as a police department from our perspective, but what's the community feeling? And so we used the assessment to pull in a lot of different perspectives through focus groups and interviews that were able to identify what folks in the community were really struggling with and wanted to be addressed. So, so we went through that process. At the same time, we started looking at what we could do differently internally and looking at the model, the CompStat 360 model, and maybe was there anything else that we could leverage it for? And we started to customize what we wanted to do for Manchester. So one of the things we did was we liked the model, we liked the problem-solving model that's laid out in the toolkit, and we stood up kind of an internal problem-solving team among law enforcement partners, and we created these law enforcement only meetings, intelligence meetings around crime problems that followed the model. So we started to customize the approach to what we needed in Manchester. At the same time, we started trying to identify what problems we wanted to go after and standing up problem-solving teams to address those. I will say on that note, with the problem-solving teams, through the technical assistance, it was suggested that we start with one problem-solving team and kind of get it down and move forward. I can say I tend to bite off more than I can chew, and thought, no, we can definitely roll out 3 problem-solving teams at once and drive forward. And that was a mistake, because what happened was we did really well with one, but the 2 others didn't really get off the ground in the same way. And it did find that we did have to really focus on one first before that we can scale up. But I think the good thing about the framework is it is scalable, right? So you can start with one, kind of get it down, understand how you want to engage folks, how you want to develop metrics, and then scale from there. So just a quick note on kind of following the suggestions that come up in this process. So NPI did their assessment and came back with findings for us. And there was 4 main things that kind of came up for Manchester within those interviews and focus groups that occurred. Now, number 1 was gun crime and fear of gun crime. We heard that quite a bit. And that was both internal and external. Recruitment and retention was one that really, was a significant part internal from Manchester, but we also heard it from our outside partners and people from the community. They recognized some of the challenges that we were having around numbers and staffing, but also around the diversity of the department and things like that. So that came up in those conversations. Officer mental health and wellness was one area that came up very much internally, but also with our city partners and some of our other kind of public safety partners, something that we wanted to make sure that we were working on ahead of. And then relationships with the immigrant communities, that came up a number of times. And so with that, the chief developed his priorities to start driving the strategy forward with how we wanted to approach things. And what he kind of wanted to focus on initially was the issue of gun crime and fear of gun crime, the officer mental health and wellness piece, and recruitment and retention. So that's what we started with. And from those priority areas, we started to develop the problem solving teams. And we started with the gun violence problem solving team. And that's the one we've really stuck with and developed. And I'm going to kind of go into detail here about what we did with it. The big thing was we wanted to make sure, again, we followed the model and kept these problem solving teams small, but relevant and on topic. So we pulled together participants through existing relationships, but also through referrals. And 2, we were having a lot of conversations in the community about gun violence, especially as we all experience when something happens, people start to call, people do want to engage. Well, this was offered an opportunity to get those folks who were being vocal about the issues and getting them to the table to help discuss and help us help them. And so that was really important for us to do. One note on the problem solving team, what I found was you really need a champion or 2 champions to drive these teams forward. So you have to have somebody that's going to be a leader to not only just bring everybody together, but plan these meetings, but also gain the buy-in of all the participants and keep things going. And so that was important. From my perspective, I think it is an important role of the police department to do that. I think we can be leaders there to do that and drive it forward. But it's not to be the only voice in the room either, right? It's to be that person that's creating the collaboration among the group. So as we got together and first started to meet, we started discussing issues, and we really wanted to be data driven with what we were doing around gun violence. And so we started trying to bring in data from all the partners to help us understand what we were doing, to help us understand what the issues were, and really use that data to inform any responses coming up. But first, we had to really understand what the data was saying. So one thing we did as a police department is we stepped forward to share our data, and we tried to do it in a transparent way. Things that we really had not shared publicly prior, not for any reason, just, I think prior to this, we felt like it was a police issue, anything around gun violence, and there was no, I guess, necessarily need to share out data in a detailed way. But what we did as part of this process is we looked at, okay, what questions are we asking as police? Like, what's important to us? What questions are we getting from the public? And especially, we were having a growing problem, so we're getting more questions. And so what was the public asking about this? And so we developed dashboards to take a look at our gun violence issue. And then we brought it forward to the problem solving team, and it created a level of transparency. I think that was important that these community partners had not seen from the police department before. So that helped gain buy-in. And I think it helped also get them to want to contribute to this as well. So it showed, again, we were trying to lead by example here and bring it forward. So on the next slide, I just have that dashboard just to show, and places have a lot more robust dashboards. This is what worked for us and what we how we track things. So there's pros and cons about this dashboard, but really we look on the left side there, just like what happened last week, and then where are we at on a couple of big key metrics. So how many gun incidents did we have last week? How many of them were gunfire events? How many non-fatal shootings have we had? What's our case clearance? And then we look at trends over time. So the top two graphs there are just where we are year to date compared to the years prior for both gun incidents and the subset of that being those that were gunfire incidents. Look at the arrests that we've had over time year to date and how that compares to the prior years. And then we use just some running total graphs to see what these trends look like compared to the years past. So 2022, we continue to see challenges, and we've had more issues in the past. But those are important things to track, and these are metrics that we're not only sharing internally with our law enforcement group to keep us on track and identify where issues might be coming from, but we also are sharing them regularly with the problem-solving team so that they are just as informed about what we're seeing in the community, and we can really start those conversations. So from this, we brought our data forward and we started trying to develop what other data can help inform this problem. For me, being a data guy, I have put mechanisms in place in our department to make sure our data is pretty good. And I believe in our data, but I also know there's a lot that we don't have and that we want to see. So we used the toolkit to help us figure out what other data we could bring in, but we also engaged with the partners to figure out what kind of data that could come in. The big topic that constantly came up, what was the involvement of youth in our gun crime issues, in our gun violence issues. That constantly came up from our community partners. That it clearly was the major concern. We were able to do a deeper dive in our police data and look at and say, yeah, the vast majority of our gun violence is youth between 14 and 24 for any involvements in gun violence, and also our victims and our offenders. So that was something we were able to take away. But what else can we pull, right? That's just, a youth was involved in an incident kind of period. We can dig a little bit and look at gang and group related conflict, but there's more out there. So we went to our partners and it was great. Our public health partners came back with the youth behavioral risk survey data and said, hey, this is pretty informative to this problem as well. And I think tells us about fear of gun violence in the community by youth, and maybe that's contributing to the problem. We had the schools come in and talk about some truancy data and also just what they were seeing in the schools as the schools reopened, which was great. We talked about trying to get our Division of Child, Youth, and Family Services to, in aggregate, talk about intake reports related to gun violence. That one is one that hasn't come together, but we still continue to try to pursue. But we also just bring in, I think, perspectives from the neighborhoods too as to what's going on. So that's been important information to have, and then to lead forward with how we're going to approach this. And it helped us to brainstorm moving forward what we wanted to do. So I talked a little bit about the toolkit, just very kind of briefly. What the toolkit has to offer is really breaks down what types of measures you can bring in, like specific measurements to identify the problem within each of the three components of the CompStat 360 model. And so that was helpful because when we got stuck on something, or maybe there was an area that was still a little fuzzy when it came to especially that youth and gun violence issue, we can go to the toolkit and help identify some measures. So there's just some good tools there that agencies can use and problem-solving teams can use to get better and move forward. So moving on to the next slide here. When we talk about what metrics we wanted to use, it started with the stakeholders that came in. So we have our police data. We were a stakeholder. We started bringing in our partners, figuring out what they could bring to the table for data to help inform the problem. But then it was kind of, all right, we have a good amount of information about gun violence in Manchester. Now, what does success look like? And so that was a big topic for us to help identify what metrics we could then use to show if responses were going up or down. I like to think about the North Star concept when it comes to these types of issues. Is, is gun violence going up or down? Are we getting better or are we getting worse? And so we were able to start there and then dig down further. And I'll get into this a little bit more. There's also the concept of what metrics can be collected reasonably. One thing I found from these problem-solving teams is we would talk about data and then there would be more questions than there was answers. And it gets to a point where, you could do dissertations on this topic, right, for one community. And some data is easily obtainable and others takes a very long time. So it was setting some expectations around that as well. But also in some instances, setting up the systems to collect data that is important to our community members so that they can get the feedback that they want. I'm going to talk about that a little bit on the next couple slides. And then identifying and really trying to get partners to commit to providing data. I don't think that they are always used to doing that. And so it's not just the responsibility of Manchester Police to come forward with the data, right, to problem solving team. No, it's everybody needs to contribute to this. We will lead by example, but we're also going to try to have some accountability for our partners too, to bring data to the table. So what came out of this was our response plan. And so we developed a gun violence reduction strategy for the city out of our problem solving team. We used the data that we collected to inform responses and developed a strategy based on that data. And it came to a 4-pronged approach. And I'm going to go into each area here, but it's focus on youth, focus on place, building community, and focused policing. And then it's, okay, what measures are we going to use to track that strategy in each prong of the strategy to understand if it is being impactful? And I'll go into just to give you an idea as to how the problem-solving team, what the result was from our collaborative work together on each of these pronged areas. So the first one being focused on youth, we identified through the data that youth did have disproportionate involvement in our gun violence issues. And then we talked about, okay, what are some gaps there? One gap being we didn't really have a very good street outreach program for youth. So that's something that we were wanted to commit to starting and bringing that resource. We're seeing changes in our juvenile justice system in New Hampshire. The court diversion is a big part of that for juveniles, and so making sure that we are engaged with juvenile court diversion, and they have a seat at the table, and we're also talking about these things. So focusing on that was important. We talked a lot about connection with families, especially with some of the immigrant community members, because of families and parents might not having a full understanding of what's going on in the community, and that connection with families could be a vital component to this. And that really came out of discussions within the problem-solving team from some of those representatives that were able to speak to that. And then what we realized too, we did an assessment of, all right, what's already going on to support youth in the community. And that was great because our partners brought a lot to the table on that. Everyone's kind of working with many different organizations. And so we did that assessment. We said, okay, we want to make sure, and sorry, I had a typo on that slide. We want to make sure that we were investing in those partnerships, but also supporting their ongoing efforts and tracking. And so those are commitments that we wanted to make. The focus on place, this goes back to being evidence-based in what we're doing and making sure through the problem-solving team process that our participants also understood what's evidence-based and what's not when it comes to possible responses. That's also where technical assistance comes in to help, being able to provide those resources in consumable formats for our problem-solving team to understand what are things that could possibly work. So things that we want to do is development of our community health worker program. That's something we've stood up with ARPA funds for the health department, wanting our community health workers to engage at places where gun crime clusters, obviously safety being a component, but looking at those hotspot areas for public health type related issues was a part we can do. Partnering with our public works on environmental factors within gun crime hotspots. And I'm talking about gun crime hotspots. I realized I didn't really mention that. That's part of the data assessment that we did and looking at where gun crime is happening. We identified hotspot areas. And so that's where this focus is. So I apologize about that. But also wanted to focus our proactive work we have a neighborhood enhancement team, which is a collaborative team among city departments that will say there's a vacant lot or a vacant structure or a problem address. This neighborhood enhancement team will go out and work to problem solve some of those issues, whether it's with code violations, fire safety issues, anything like that. But making sure they were kind of directing their work within these places where gun crime was clustering, and then increased guardianship. And by that, I mean adding guardianship through more police presence in those places to hopefully make it safer, kind of routine activities theory type of process. Building community was a big part we talked about. We felt there was a lack of community engagement, especially in these neighborhoods where we have clusters of gun crime occur that are kind of chronic spaces for that. And so we thought this is where a few of the other mechanisms kind of merge, but that community health worker program, they are designed to help develop community and bring people together. And so we really wanted to leverage the community health workers to work with the people living in these neighborhoods to bring them together, to encourage the use of some micro grants that are available, to have things like block parties, to have things like cleanups or whatever it might be, but just enhance that community cohesion. And then also really leverage the foot patrols in hotspots, that increased guardianship to build community. And through this process, we talked a lot about having those foot patrols not be enforcement based, but be community engagement based. And so we talked about in collecting measures for this, what we're going to collect from our officers wasn't going to be what type of enforcement action did they take while doing foot patrols, but what type of community engagement action did they take? Because that's what's going to kind of make them do what they're going to do while they're on a foot patrol. If you're asking for how many arrests did you make, well, they're going to go out and try to make an arrest. If we're asking them, how many people did you talk to while you were out on your foot patrol, well, that's what they're going to try to do. So that came out of these conversations with our problem solving team, which I think was fantastic. And then focused policing. So this was one, right? This is what we do as police officers. We want to go out and investigate crimes and do police work. And so we put together, this is what we want to bring to the table as a police agency to help with this problem. We wanted to look at evidence-based practices to do so. So part of it was identifying prolific and chronic offenders, working on enforcement towards those offenders, not doing broad-based crackdowns in the neighborhoods, but no, who are drivers of violence, and let's try to go after those folks. But at the same time, let's also see what we can do for outreach on some of those folks that maybe we can't put cases on, or we have put cases on, but maybe some additional resources could help. And so that's where the problem solving team also helped, was with that street outreach effort and guiding that street outreach effort towards some of these chronic offenders. We established a gun violence operation intelligence meeting. I talked about that more. That came out of our work with CompStat 360 initially, which was good, but that's a law enforcement only meeting where we're sharing information, creating action items, and achieving those action items and tracking it over time for law enforcement. Part of our focused policing work is leveraging crime gun intelligence through NIBIN, through tracing, and through some other technologies to help us, again, identify the right people and use data to inform our investigations. I'm going to take a little more time on this slide only because this was a really important part of where the problem solving team really came into play. So the other component of the focused policing I talked about is where's those hotspot patrols, the foot patrols, and also just regular directed patrols in hotspots. Well, the problem solving team helped us to recognize that there was a significant concern that these directed patrols would have disparate impacts on minority groups within these neighborhoods. These neighborhoods where we had hotspots occurring were majority minority neighborhoods. And so there was concern that our actions by having more police in these spaces was going to have disparate impacts. And that was raised and discussed a lot. I got, I think, frustrated at points because of that, because I'm trying to say, no, we're not going in there to do enforcement work and crackdown work. But frankly, I think we had to build some trust to make that understood. That was going to happen, and trust that like we weren't just saying that and it was lip service, that in fact we were going to go in and do all this enforcement work. So there's a lot of conversation about that, and it was really good perspectives for us to hear as a police department that of how big a concern that was, because it is something that we need to take into account and make sure that we are tracking, and that has helped to inform our metrics of the measures that we're following. So we created for our measures, for every single one of those prongs are metrics for each focus area for each of those prongs. The overall goal being, is that North Star concept again, is gun crime going up? Is it going down? Are we having more or less shooting incidents? Are we having more or less non-fatal shootings? And tracking those things as kind of the North Star. But then within each focus area was, all right, well, how are we tracking our work towards our focus on youth, our focus on place, and really breaking it down so that we can continue to report back on it. But probably the biggest part of this was racial bias data and tracking because of those concerns. So out of the conversations around our focused policing efforts, we said, okay, there is this concern. We are going to track it throughout this process and report back to our problem-solving team those kind of demographic makeup of our enforcement activity, of our focused policing activity, if we are making more arrests or enforcement actions within hotspots, and use that data to help understand if there is an issue. And then if there is an issue that comes up, we can work to address it and identify why that's happening and move forward. So that was just something that was really eye-opening for me, during that process. And I think if we didn't have the problem-solving team, we probably as an agency wouldn't be tracking it in the same detail that we are because of this, and being able to have that feedback and that back and forth with our group. So that's the big thing with the measures. So now we are at a part of tracking these measures over time and making changes as needed to our strategy. So when we talk about our ongoing efforts with this, we're meeting regularly, providing data and updates with not only our police data, but our partner data. But we're also seeing, okay, if things are working, if they're not, what can we do? So an example is with the hotspot, the focus on place, we aren't really seeing the impacts that we expected to see. And so with the problem solving team, we wanted to generate new ideas to see, what more we could do, or maybe what we were missing. And so we used some workshop methods with the problem solving team to identify new things that we could do or things that we could reinforce. And so I just strongly recommend using some of these methods. What we did for this project specifically was we provided data around what's going on in those hotspots exactly to help inform an understanding of the problems, and then just started working through, had everyone using sticky notes, write down what the challenges were in those spaces. We grouped what those challenges were. And so some of the things that were identified were things like, trash, just kind of overall cleanliness, issues with youth in the area, issues with mental health and homelessness in those places. And so by identifying those from the problem solving group, we have some areas that we can then try to be impactful on. Then we looked at, okay, what's kind of the low hanging fruit? What can we do right now to hopefully make a difference within these hotspot areas? What you see on this picture here is just a pretty easy process of whiteboard of 2 axes. One's about impact, one's about effort. And then taking each group and saying, okay, the homelessness issue, is that something that would be very impactful? And everyone's like, yeah, that would be impactful if we could really help get a hold of the homelessness issue in there. Okay, what's the effort level on there? Is that an easy thing to do, are a hard thing to do. And so you start working through with the group on what's achievable. And what we landed on was it was a lot of environmental issues around cleanliness, around lighting, some of the crime prevention through environmental design, the CPTED factors that we could maybe address that could be both very impactful, but have, minimal effort. There's some effort involved, right? But compared to other issues that are much more long-term, that's something that we can attack right now and potentially have a lot of good out of. And so we're trying to use these workshop methods with our problem-solving teams to come up with good responses that can be effective. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that a little bit. So lastly, the last thing I'm going to talk about is just kind of overcoming challenges. Like we talked about at the beginning, this takes time. This took a long time to get together, especially going through data, a lot of questions, a lot of discussion, a lot of appetite for more and more data to help inform the discussion. But then using the framework to help guide us down the road of actually developing responses, putting it on paper, and driving forward with those strategies and with those responses and tracking them over time. So it does take time, but following that framework is helpful to keep on track and doing it. Tailoring what you're doing to your community's needs. So if you need to make little tweaks here and there, that's something that can help you overcome challenges. And then demonstrate by doing. I believe that while all of the public safety issues that you might want to address might not necessarily be directly police issues, I think we can be leaders in this space by bringing these frameworks forward and bringing people together to help be a part of a collaborative solution to some of these problems. So that demonstrate by doing is really important, and taking a lead role with this. And then lastly, for challenges, I think it's important to bring in diverse perspectives to the problem-solving team. Engaging with those folks can be challenging, but it at the end is very, very, very valuable. So one of the contributing members to our problem-solving team is very vocal about being a police abolitionist, but she also brings some of the most I think help to the police department when it comes to talking through these problems and making sure that we're doing the right things as a police agency. So I just wanted to touch that it's so important to engage and have like that respectful dialogue between who comes to the table, because at least they are coming to the table, and that's what we want, right? We want them to come to the table and participate. So that's an overview of Manchester. Appreciate the time, and I think Sarah, you're going to talk about some of the training technical assistance stuff that's available.
Yes, thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
I just wanted to conclude the webinar with just a very basic overview of the type of training and technical assistance that the National Policing Institute can provide through the CS360 project. As you can see, we typically offer two different modes of the assistance. The first being comprehensive model deployment. And so with that, it is more along the lines of the work that Matt described at the beginning. We can help with the scanning phase and setting that piece up and being that kind of third party to kind of set the stage a little bit more neutral for your community, as well as your internal officers and any other administrative staff that you want involved. And then also we can offer more direct targeted assistance. So we can just jump in and help where you think you need the most help. It can be around data collection, community engagement, problem solving training, anything along those lines. It's really intended to be malleable to your department. We want this to work for you all. We don't want to force you into how this would work in the a perfect world. So we really want this to be able to be something that you can mold into what will work best for your department. And so in order to request this training and technical assistance, you can visit the CS360 website that we've referenced a few times. You can see the web address down at the bottom of that slide there. And you're welcome to reach out anytime. And I just wanted to take a second also to thank both Matt and Melissa for their time in presenting today, and also thank our funders and partners on this project, the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the MacArthur Foundation, and Microsoft. And so I think we might have a time for maybe 1 or 2 questions. We have about 5 minutes left, and I'll pop. This is the email address to reach out. If we're not able to get to your question, feel free to send them my way, and I can get them to Matt or Melissa, either way, and we can get you your answers. So if anybody has any questions, you can throw them in the chat, or you can unmute and ask your question. But if not, we can let everybody go with 5 minutes. Matt, can you see the chat?
Yeah, it looks like there's a question here about how we track shootings in near real time, a shooting database. So we built it into our RMS to be able, essentially a checkbox under within an incident that says this was a gun crime, this was a shooting incident, or this was a non-fatal shooting. Check that box. We built in systems so that our crime analyst is tracking that daily and checking that box so that we can really run the stats at any time. One of the, I think, key things about that assessment phase and hearing about the gun violence and fear of gun violence from our community members, both and internally too, among our folks, makes it a priority, as it should. And because it's a priority, okay, we're going to develop the systems and provide and put the resources in to making sure we understand this the best we can based on our work. So hopefully that helps answer. And Sarah, there's just questions about if participants will have access to the recording from today's seminar. I think you are going to post it, correct?
Yes, so we are recording it and we'll post it to the CS360 website. If you reach out to me via email, though, I could send it to you that way as well.
Cool. And then question was how many police officers or professional staff are supporting the community, the problem solving team effort. For us, it's all auxiliary duty work that we do. So it's no one's working on it full time per se. It's just stuff that I think integrates a lot with what we are doing anyway, day to day, but it's just something else that we're doing. But I'm kind of a lead. I have 2 officers that help support, and really their support, I think, is showing up and engaging for the most part. I have a crime analyst who's very involved in this. And that's probably kind of the big thing. We didn't want too much, I guess, police, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but police representation at the meetings. We didn't want to drown out everyone else by having a lot of police officers show up. So we've been kind of careful and deliberate with that.
Okay, great. If there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and conclude. Just as a reminder, we'll send out that post webinar survey via email if you wouldn't mind taking a few minutes to fill that out. And otherwise, have a great day, everyone.